I distinctly remember being introduced to the Fate universe when some friends convinced me to read the Fate Stay Night visual novel like a month before I started university. And although it took me way too long to actually finish reading through it, it was all I could think about. I would often geek out with friends about the world building, the various systems, the characters, the fights, and amidst all that, Ufotable's anime adaptation of Fate Zero came along to mesmerize and traumatize all of us. It was a great time. And later on, it was announced that they were working on an adaptation for Unlimited Blade Works, which had all of us over the moon.
Let's talk about the moon.
You be quiet about the moon.
But then something happened. Right before the first episode was scheduled to air, they revealed that they've been working on a new project that would forever change how I viewed video games. Fate Grand Order. Although the 2-minute trailer was fairly bare bones and didn't show any gameplay, Sakamoto Maya's narration coupled with the now iconic main theme had all of us enthralled. And all we knew was that it was a mobile game, something none of us expected. And right after the first season of the anime had ended, the game launched. In Japan. So we had to live vicariously through people uploading videos onto YouTube, which was honestly still kind of exciting. And we would only have to wait 2 years until they announced the NA version, which everyone was fully expecting. I still remember that very summer I immediately got my hands on a brand new iPhone SE, installed the game the moment it was available, and didn't get to play the game because my friends introduced me to the world of re-rolling. So instead, we spent like 2 weeks trying to get our Gilgamesh, Waver, and Tamamo. I did eventually end up with MP2 Gilgamesh and a Tamamo, but I would get Waver for 4 entire years, so that was cool. Anyway, the gameplay was fairly engaging, the amount of viable characters and teams were staggering, and the grind was tedious, but I spent most of my adult life playing MMOs, so I was kind of used to it by then anyway. Ultimately, the key part for me was the story. Now, FGO had the benefit of many prior works having done a lot of the world building already, so it didn't need to do a whole lot to introduce the setting, the systems, all the rules, which allowed them to immediately throw you into familiar territory. Fuyuki City, the setting of Fate Stay Night. Kind of. Except not, whatever. My point is that while the storytelling was done in a familiar visual novel style in a familiar setting, the added gameplay did a lot to get me immersed into the game itself. Although it wasn't really until Camelot and Babylonia that I was actually hooked onto the main story, the various events and side content did keep me logging in regularly. And after the climactic ending, the Lost Belts came along, and that shit was a game changer. Literally, the writing quality had improved over the years, sure, but it really suddenly felt like a completely different game. I will admit I've since dropped the game after having finished Lost Belt 6, but man, let me tell you, that shit was peak. To this day, I still think about the scenes with Orion and Artemis in Atlantis, Hirstari in Olympus, and Muramasa in Avalon. Absolute fucking cinema. But the thing is that writing and storytelling are two very different things. Writing is more of a skill, a craft, an ability to communicate ideas and concepts to the reader, while storytelling is more so an art form in the sense that no matter how intriguing your story is, if it's not done in a manner that consistently engages the reader, then the twists and turns either won't have any impact or just never happen because they've already stopped reading it. And in that regard, I do think the storytelling was done relatively well in FGO. But due to the nature of the setting, there's a constant need to introduce different casts of characters from various backgrounds, which then leads to a growing number of opposing perspectives, but there's only so much story they can tell in each section, and then the pacing of the story may suffer, and then the tension just keeps building and takes way too long to resolve. It's all a balancing act that unfortunately is incredibly subjective. No story will truly be able to appeal to everybody, and sometimes, as a reader, you're forced to either acknowledge that fact and trudge through the less exciting portions of the story, or weigh your options and figure out if you care enough to continue reading at all. If you've played games like Genshin, Star Rail, or Wuthering Waves, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. There are plenty of exciting moments in each of their stories, all kinds of lore reveals, exciting boss fights, memorable cutscenes, but those moments are often short-lived, and sometimes you have to go back and ponder on whether the 5 hours of exploration, exposition, and dialogue was worth those very moments. Which is why pacing is the big one that most people have a problem with. Honkai Star Rail is, in my opinion, one of the biggest offenders in that regard. The world building is incredibly meticulous, yet vast. The setting is still largely full of holes, but still intriguing. The characters are a mixed bag, but in my opinion, a net positive overall. But the pacing of the story is a mess. There is so much unnecessary fluff in the dialogue that it's really hard to maintain interest even during key parts of the story. What should be a tool to get the reader attached to the characters, invested in the story, and immersed into the setting often feels like it's just trying to meet some arbitrary word count requirement without adding anything remotely substantial. When used in moderation, the use of casual interactions between characters is an important tool to convince the reader that bonds are being formed, developed, or tested to humanize the cast. When it's 5, 6, 7 scenes in a row, you can't help but feel like the writers are desperately trying to force you to become emotionally invested in a way that doesn't feel organic, which can then break the illusion and reveal that these are just one-dimensional characters that they're trying to sell you on, figuratively and literally. And while we're here, another issue I've come across is the passage of time in a broad sense. For example, there are some scenes where a lot of things happen and you're shown various groups of characters interacting with each other. But then 2 hours of exploring and reading later, you discover that all of this happened in the span of like 10 minutes. And other times we fight a group of enemies and then we get hit with a black screen with white text telling us that 3 entire days of defending the town have suddenly passed. Huh? When? I didn't do that. Granted, the perception of time is really hard to nail in narrative experiences like these, as opposed to an action-adventure RPG where you're running through fields fighting hordes of enemies to get to your next quest objective, while your party members argue over the morality of a man cheating on multiple women. If you know, you know. And another example is the sense of urgency. There are so many moments where characters will just stand there calmly talking to each other for like 10 minutes, right in front of a pack of enemies, blankly staring at them in the middle of a world-ending crisis that they're supposedly tasked with stopping. Not exactly the right time to reminisce about that one time your professor embarrassed a classmate in front of your peers. And that's what I mean by writing versus storytelling. Some of these interactions can be important for character and lore development, but TPO is everything, and dropping the wrong lines at the wrong moments can so easily break the reader's suspension of disbelief and really pull them out of the story. And all of this is such a shame because I did really enjoy the setting and story of Amphoreus, but due to the terrible pacing, I could never get as fully invested as I wished I could until the very end, which by at that point, it was almost too late. In a similar vein, Wuthering Waves had quite a few problems with this in Huanglong. The writing was half decent, but it spent most of its time teaching about the setting and not nearly enough time with character development. We started with so many questions, and instead of looking for answers to them, we were just given a different set of questions that took precedence due to an alleged impending disaster. This was largely improved in Black Shores, and was actually flipped entirely in Renacida, where it focused heavily on its characters while only giving you snippets of the overarching plot. Not exactly what I had in mind, but the main plot itself wasn't overly complicated, so I think it was the correct move as far as story goes. That said, the lore reveals involving the rover and their past self were genuinely more interesting, and the rest of Renacida did kind of just feel like a side quest to me. But fortunately, or unfortunately, I was already pretty invested in a lot of the characters, so I didn't mind it as much. Though as a side note, I think the climax of the final chapter was a little too campy for my tastes, and the pre-rendered cutscenes definitely broke my immersion quite a bit, but the final cinematic was hype as fuck, so I'll forgive it. All of that said, I'm gonna come clean. I don't think any of these games even hold a candle to the combined writing and storytelling of games like Arknights, Punishing Grey Raven, and even Zenless Zone Zero. Each of these games blend everything together in a way that a lot of other games failed to do. In Arknights, each of the main acts are broken up into several episodes, and a lot of the earlier ones are definitely full of wordy exposition, but to me, it felt like it always pulled me back into the setting at the right moments, just in time for each climax to come crashing in. One downside, however, if you could call it that, is that the world of Arknights is immense, and you'll probably want to sift through past events if you want to get the full picture. Otherwise, you'll likely be missing key details regarding certain characters and factions, especially the intermezzi chapters. Thankfully, there is an entire timeline, as well as resources to help you figure out what to read and when, but it is kind of a lot. On top of all that, it can feel like there are way too many characters to keep track of, and it's really easy to get lost in the setting if you're not taking notes. Usually it's not a problem since each region's stories are largely self-contained, but when they interact with the Rhodes Island during certain story sections, it can be difficult to keep track of when this is all happening, who's an ally, who's a bad guy, have you even met these people yet? Again, it is kind of a lot, but they largely do a good job of filling in the missing details if it's relevant to the story. As for PGR, they release full chapters with each update that tell a complete story while mainly focusing on one character or faction, so it can be a mixed bag depending on how quickly you can sympathize with the characters involved. But since the chapters are largely self-contained, you get a full package experience that doesn't suffer from making you wait several updates for the story to resolve. The pace of each chapter moves quickly, but have enough substance to get you acquainted and comfortable with the characters. The passage of time also feels somewhat natural going from chapter to chapter, especially since you'll often see familiar faces as the stories progress. Additionally, the devs have also rolled out an update that basically summarizes the early chapters of the game, so you can effectively skip them and dive right into the good stuff, so that's cool. I did personally enjoy reading through them just to learn about the setting and characters, but you can really tell they're from much older versions of the game, so take that into consideration. And finally, we can move on to Zenless Zone Zero. Now, I don't think Zenless's writing is particularly extraordinary, but the way it does its storytelling is almost perfect in my opinion. One key part is that the main characters, Wise and Belle, are their own characters. They each have their own quirks and personalities, and they're both present in the story at all times, which I think that's a better job of drawing you into the setting than a silent self-insert character like many other games utilize. Next, the usage of free roam, visual novel, and comic book styles also keeps things fresh and engaging, and despite the growing number of factions, the entire cast of characters really feel like they're a part of a moving, lived-in world, especially with how often they make cameo appearances when suitable. And lastly, the dialogue, casting, and voice direction in this game are amazing. Thanks in part due to its more modern, urban setting, most of the characters are going to feel more familiar and relatable, although sometimes they do go a little overboard with pop culture references and trendy lingo. I personally find it mostly endearing, with a few exceptions. And naturally, it's hard to compare the visual novel style of games like Arknights, PGR, and FGO to one using 3D models like Genshin and Wuthering Waves. For the former, word count will naturally be much higher since they have to describe the scenes as they happen, but when the exposition goes on for too long, it can easily bring the reader out of the very scene they're painting. While for the latter, it can kind of be challenging to convince the reader that these 3D models are in fact interacting with each other and not just doing default poses in front of each other. Which is why I think Zenless does it best by utilizing a combination of methods, especially since even their visual novel sections utilize very expressive 3D models anyway. As a side note, it also frustrates me when dialogue gets cut off in free roam sections just because you walk into the next zone. That goes for most 3D games actually. More of a pet peeve than anything, but it'd be nice if they made it clearer when a cutscene is about to trigger. I will say I've also heard great things about games like Girls Frontline, Olympus Company, and Counterside. Admittedly, I haven't gotten around to playing them, and I don't know if I ever will, especially with Enfield right around the corner. But maybe one day when I'm caught up on everything. Anyway, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching and listening. This more or less serves as a pilot episode and resume for Gacha game content, and I'd love to hear about your experiences and opinions about the ones you've played. This was also all to set up a series where I'll be rating all the Gacha games I've played this far to find out which ones are still worth playing and which ones I should probably drop from my rotation in favor of other ones. But until then, take it easy out there. Hope to see you soon. Cheers.